Alright. Disconnect. Press play.
Hammered in my chest.
A blunt.
The rush of water now a distant sound as every nerve in my body stood on edge. I didn't move for a moment. My breathing shallow, and even as I tried to process what had just happened,
As you can
I should have
tell,
been
I
angry,
finished on the foundation.
mortified even.
Gang,
But what I
gang.
felt instead was far more complicated.
This
The memory
is
of his
my
silhouette
cell and my lovely
burned in my
cell.
mind. The way he
In the
had frozen in
foundation.
place. As startled as I was. But with something else. Something unspoken in the tension of his posture. When I finally stepped out of the shower, my skin was still flushed, though not entirely from the heat of the water. I wrapped myself tightly in a towel, my hands trembling as I wiped the condensation from the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, my cheeks pink and my hair down, clinging to my shoulders. I avoided looking at myself for too long. Back in my room, I shut the door behind me with a soft click, leaning against it as I tried to steady my breathing. My mind replayed the scene over and over again, dissecting every second of it. The way he had hesitated, the sharp intake of breath I barely heard over the water, the hurried footsteps as he retreated. There was a knock at my door, soft but insistent, and my heart leapt into my throat. I wrapped my towel more securely around me before cracking the door open just enough to see Liam standing there. His expression a mix of apology and something else. Something that made my stomach twist in a way I didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know you were in there. I swear. It's fine," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. But it wasn't fine. Not really. I couldn't look at him without replaying that moment, without feeling the heat rise in my cheeks all over again. "I should have knocked," he continued, running a hand through his hair in a nervous gesture. His eyes darted to mine and then away as though he couldn't decide where to look. "Yeah," I said softer this time. "You should have." He hesitated, his hand still resting on the door frame before nodding. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice quieter now. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, each moment thick with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed to know how to address. We avoided each other as much as possible, but when our paths did cross briefly in the hallway or the kitchen, the air between us felt heavy, charged with something unnameable. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of his silhouette on the other side of the glass. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the moment that stayed with me. It was the way it had made me feel seen in a way I wasn't used to, and wanted in a way I didn't dare admit. Sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts were too loud, my emotions too raw, and my body too restless. I couldn't ignore the pull I felt, the way my mind kept drifting back to him despite my best efforts to think about anything else. And as the hours ticked by, one question echoed in my mind, relentless and unyielding. What happens now? The morning light filtered through the blinds, painting faint stripes across my bedroom wall as I sat on the edge of my bed, still wrapped in the soft terry cloth robe I had thrown on the night before. The house was silent, but my thoughts were deafening, the memory of what had happened in the bathroom replaying in vivid detail. I tried to push it away, to file it under accidents and move on. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw him again, his startled expression, the way his breath hitched, the brief pause before he turned to leave. The intimacy of the moment had been unintentional, fleeting, but its impact lingered like the ghost of a touch. I could still feel the heat rising to my cheeks, my pulse quickening at the thought of his silhouette framed against the frosted glass. It wasn't just the embarrassment, it was the way it made me feel seen. But in a way I wasn't used to. In a way that stirred something deep and unsettling within me. I shook my head, trying to dispel the thoughts that clung to me like cobwebs. But as much as I wanted to forget, my body betrayed me. My heart fluttering at the memory of his voice. His presence. I told myself it was nothing. Just a momentary lapse of judgment. But I couldn't deny the pull I felt. The strange magnetic energy that seemed to buzz in the space between us. By the time I made my way downstairs, the house was still quiet. Liam was nowhere to be seen. And for a brief moment, I was relieved. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. The kitchen felt cool and green. The soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. I poured myself a cup of coffee, hoping the bitter warmth would steady my nerves. As I stood by the counter, sipping slowly, I heard the faint creak of the stairs. My breath caught, my grip tightening on the mug as his footsteps grew louder. When he appeared in the doorway, my heart skipped a beat. He looked disheveled, his hair slightly mussed, and his shirt clinging to his chest in a way that made it hard to look away. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze meeting mine before quickly darting away. "Morning," he said, his voice gruff as though he hadn't spoken yet today. "Morning," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. I busied myself with my coffee, hoping to mask the flush creeping up my neck. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched heavy and awkward, the unspoken tension between us palpable. I could feel his eyes on me, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't ignore the way my body responded to his presence. My skin felt warm, my breath shallow, every nerve ending hyper-aware of the space between us. "I'm sorry about last night," he began, his voice hesitant. I wanted to say I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. "It's fine," I interrupted, more sharply than I intended. I set my mug down, the clink of ceramic against the counter louder than I expected. "It was an accident. Let's just forget it. Okay?" "Right," he said, nodding, but his tone was laced with something I couldn't quite place. Regret. Frustration. I wasn't sure. But the way he shifted on his feet, his hands flexing at his sides, made it clear he wasn't as ready to move on as he claimed to be. I turned away, pretending to busy myself with the dishes in the sink. But I could feel him behind me, his presence a constant weight. The room felt smaller with him in it. The air charged in a way that made it hard to breathe. My hands trembled as I scrubbed a plate, the soapy water slipping between my fingers. "You seem tense," he said, his voice closer now. I hadn't heard him move, but when I turned, he was standing just a few feet away, his eyes searching mine. "I'm not," I said quickly, but the words rang hollow. My pulse was racing, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His gaze was steady, intense, and I felt my resolve waver under the weight of it. "You don't have to be," he said, his voice softer now, almost tender. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I replied, though my voice betrayed me, trembling slightly. I was just surprised. That's all." He nodded, but his eyes lingered, tracing the curve of my face, the line of my neck. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but not in a way that made me want to run. It was a different kind of vulnerability, one that sent a shiver down my spine, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I'll give you space, he said after a moment. His tone gentle. But he didn't move. Instead, he stayed there, his presence filling the room. The tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. When he finally did step back, the air seemed to shift, the charged energy dissipating just slightly. He grabbed a glass of water from the counter, his movements slow and deliberate as though he were trying to avoid startling me. Are we good? He asked, his voice tentative. Yeah, I said, though the word felt
Pick one
inadequate,
action.
too simple to encompass the complexity of what I was feeling. We're good. He offered a small, tentative smile before turning and walking toward the living room. I watched him go, my chest tight, my thoughts racing. The moment felt like a turning point, a line drawn in the sand. But as I stood there, the warmth of his presence still lingering in the air, I couldn't help but wonder what happens when that line is crossed. The house was dark, except for the faint golden glow spilling out from the kitchen. It was late, far later than I'd usually be awake. But sleep had been elusive all night. My mind felt like a tangled web, every thought circling back to the same place, the same person. I tried to distract myself, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, reading, even rearranging the stack of books on my nightstand. But nothing worked. So I had come downstairs, seeking solace in the quiet stillness of the house. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound as I poured myself a glass of water. The kitchen felt cool, almost chilly, and the sensation of the cold glass against my palm grounded me. If only for a moment. I leaned against the counter, the smooth surface cool beneath my fingertips, and stared out the window into the darkness beyond. The reflection of the kitchen light glinted off the glass, obscuring the view. But I wasn't really looking at anything. My thoughts were elsewhere. I didn't hear him at first. The soft creak of the stairs barely registered over the noise in my head. But when I turned, startled by the sudden awareness that I wasn't alone, there he was. Liam stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the kitchen light. He looked surprised to see me, his hand frozen mid-reach toward the doorframe. I didn't think anyone else was up, he said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Neither did I replied, setting my glass down on the counter. My heart was already racing, a steady thrum that I hoped he couldn't hear. He stepped further into the room, his bare feet making no sound against the tiled floor. He was dressed simply in a t-shirt and sweatpants, the fabric clinging to him in a way that drew my eyes before I could stop myself. There was something about the way he moved, unhurried but deliberate, that made the air between us feel charged. Couldn't sleep? He asked, leaning against the edge of the island. He was close enough that I could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, the way his hair fell slightly over his forehead, just messy enough to look effortless. No, I said softly. You? He shook his head, his gaze flicking to mine and then away as though he was afraid to look too long. No. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that filled the space between words, heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. I told myself to say something, anything, to break the tension that seemed to hang in the air like static before a storm. But my mouth felt dry, my thoughts tangled. Instead, he spoke first. It's been weird lately, he said, his voice low, almost tentative. His eyes met mine, then searching as though he was trying to gauge my reaction. I nodded, my fingers tracing absent patterns on the cool surface of the counter. Yeah, I admitted. It has. He didn't look away this time. His gaze held mine steady and unflinching, and I felt the weight of it like a physical touch. There was something in his expression, something raw and unspoken, that made my breath hitch. I didn't mean to, he began, but I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. I know, I said quickly. It was an accident. Let's not. But the words caught in my throat, and I couldn't finish the sentence, because even as I said it, I knew it wasn't the whole truth. It hadn't just been the moment in the bathroom that lingered. It was everything. That had come after the glances, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, the way my thoughts kept circling back to him, no matter how hard I tried to push them away. He stepped closer then, just slightly, but enough that I could...
Cool. Good night, baby girls. Let's go, sis. Let's do it in my room, sister. Ready? Yeah. Cool. Well, I will see you in the morning. See you then.